11. Owing to shortages, we regret to inform you that we have been forced to increase the price of the new season's bark. Shortages are due to local difficulties at source. We will, of course, be giving preferences to our most favored regular customers. Trade Federation's notice to wholesalers. Dartman had taken down quite a few tinnies on Geonosis, and one thing he'd learned was that they were built for conventional infantry combat on nice, flat ground. They weren't so clever on treacherous terrain, or without an organic officer calling the shots. He could see a group of trees 100 meters away that appeared to be skylined against nothing, and he hoped that meant there might be an escarpment on the other side. "Down there," he yelled to Etain, pointing, "Come on, and get ready to jump." He'd almost forgotten the pain in his shoulder. He clutched his rifle tight to his chest and sprinted for the tree line. It took him 10 seconds. The land sloped away below, all thorn bushes and muddy soil right down to the river, broken only by a natural back-sloping terrace that formed a small gully. When he looked back, Etain was right behind him, and he wasn't expecting her to be. "Keep going," she panted. "Don't keep looking back." The blaster fire of the advancing droids was hitting branches far too close for comfort. When they got to the edge, he simply shoved her. She tried to right herself for a second before falling and rolling down the slope. He launched himself and rolled after her. Dartman had the protections of Katarn armor, but she didn't. When they came to a halt at the bottom of the gully, Etain was minus her outer cloak and plus a lot of scrapes. But she still had 2 sections of the E-Reb cannon strapped to her share of the pack. She was clinging to them with grim determination. "Next time, let me jump, will you?" she hissed. "I'm not completely helpless." "Sorry." He checked his grenades. "I'm going to run short of ammo soon. I'm going to have to sacrifice some demolitions ordnance." "Tell me what you're planning." "Bringing down the slope with them on it." He paid out the line of micromines and scrambled a few meters back to string them horizontally between the trees. "Can you dig out some of the ball bangs from the pack, please? 4 should do it." "What are they?" "The long red sticks, custom ordnance." He heard her gasping her way up the slope behind him. When he turned his head, she was gripping a bush with one hand and holding out tubes of explosives in the other. Her fingers were covered in blood. He felt suddenly guilty, but he'd have to worry about that later. "Thanks, ma'am," he said automatically. He balanced precariously, feeling the strain in his calves, and scrambled from bush to bush. He held each ball bang perpendicular to the slope and twisted the end's cap. The cylinder whirled and burrowed deep into the ground. He spaced them at 5-meter intervals. The clicking noise of droids on the move was getting closer, killing on the still damp air. "Run," Dartman hissed. Adrenaline was a wonderful thing to see in action. Ethan grabbed her pack and bolted along the gully. Dahman followed 50 meters, 100, 200. He paused to look back and saw one thin metal faceplate peer over the edge. Down, he yelled, and squeezed the detonator in his palm. A chunk of Quilora blew apart at approximately 8,000 meters a second. Dahman heard it and regretted not seeing it. But his head was shielded by his crossed arms, and he was face down in the dirt. It was pure instinct. He should have told Ethan to cover her ears, although it wouldn't have helped her much. He should have made her run a lot sooner. He should have done a lot of things, like ignoring Janot, and instead stayed on the mission. He hadn't. He'd deal with it. The noise of the blast overloaded his helmet for a few moments. There was a crackling silence. Then sound rushed back in again, and he could feel clods of soil plopping against his back like heavy rain. When he got to his knees and turned around, there was a brand new landscape to be seen. Trees jutted out from a sharp cliff of packed mud at bizarre angles. Some had intact branches, and others were snapped off and splintered. A single metallic leg protruded from the debris. Dirt was crumbling away from the face of the cliff like red permacrete, and one tree was sliding slowly downward. Dahman looked around for Ethan. She was a few meters ahead, kneeling back on her heels with her hands to one ear. When he drew closer, he could see a thin trickle of blood running down the side of her face. "Okay," he said. Ethan stared at his mouth. "I can't hear you," she said. She nursed her left ear, face contorted with pain. "You've blown an eardrum. Take it easy." Stupid. She couldn't hear and she couldn't see his lips with his helmet on. It was reflex reassurance. He was about to look for his back display when she looked past him and pointed frantically. He turned. A droid was peering over the edge of the crater. It didn't appear to have seen them. Dahman didn't know how many there might be. He debated whether to deploy a remote, then wondered what he'd do if it showed him 100 more tinnies coming. He wasn't sure where else to run. He estimated that he could hold them off for about an hour, and then they'd be out of everything except his vibroblade and Ethan's lightsaber. Then he heard a shout. "Droids, report." Dahman flattened himself into the side of the slope beside Ethan. He could hear the voices, even if she couldn't. She stared up at the cliff and squeezed her eyes shut. For a moment, Dahman thought it was plain terror, and he wouldn't have blamed her. He'd blown away half a hillside and still hadn't stopped the droids. He was starting to feel a gnawing emptiness in his gut as well. He concentrated on the voices, trying to guess numbers. 2 humans, 2 men. They've booby-trapped. Can you see anything? There's nothing else down there. Dahman held his breath. No, they're gone. Must have speeders. Droids flam up and return. The metal face pulled back and the clinking gate faded on the ear, along with the whir of a speed engine. Then there was silence, broken only by the occasional creak of a splintered tree being pulled slowly apart on its journey down the shadowed slope. Dominic glanced at Etane. Her eyes were still shut, and she was breathing hard. "I didn't think I could do that," she said. "Do what?" She stared at him. He took off his helmet so she could see his mouth. "Do what?" Domin mouthed, exaggerating the syllables. Her gaze fixed on his lips. "Influence them. Both of them." Was that some sort of Jedi thought trick? She looked baffled. She obviously wasn't used to lip reading. "It's sort of a Jedi thought trick," she said. Domin stiffed an urge to laugh. It wasn't funny at all. She had achieved something he found almost magical. At that point in the crisis, it was the best military option. Better than letting loose with all the ordnance at his disposal. And something even Cal Scarata couldn't do. They were alive. They could move on. "Nice job, Commander," he said. "Very nicely done." He touched his glove to his forehead and grinned. "Let's get ourselves sorted, eh?" Domin took out his med pack and removed 2 shots of painkiller and the Bacta spray. He fixed his own shoulder first, jabbing the needle hard into the blue vein in the crook of his left elbow, so that the drug dispersed faster. But it still made his eyes water when he sprayed the blaster burn. Etane watched with grim resignation and swallowed visibly. "Come on, Etane," Domin said. "Hold still." He aimed the spray like a pistol into her left ear. Domin had no idea that Jedi could curse fluently in Huttese. But he was learning more about them every minute. A lot more. The excavation droid rattled down the road, managing to find every pothole and rut between Imbrani and the screening plant. Nina bounced each time, too, buried in the scoop under a layer of loose rubble, with enough explosives to level everything within half a kilometer. He was anxious. The detonators were disabled. He kept checking that. Now that night had fallen and the rain stopped, he could ease himself into a position where he could see ahead. Blue navigation's lights picked out the droid's front fender, and an amber hazard light rolled on its canopy, illuminating the trees on either side of the track. It was a lumbering thing that wouldn't get out of anyone's way. Behind it, a convoy of identical droids followed. They were an intimidating procession. Even the column of tinnies marching toward Nina moved to one side of the road. He picked them out in his night vision visor. Although the sound alone identified them, clink, rasp, it was the knee joints. Nothing but battle droids marched that regularly, not even clone troopers. There were no voices, not even the occasional command to form single file, or shut it back there. It was all grim mechanical purpose. Nina closed his fingers around the grips of the DC-17. He really didn't want to engage them. It was going to be hard enough to direct the excavator to the target and get away in one piece, without pausing for skirmishes along the route. Walk on, will you? Just walk on. He didn't want to test the manufacturer's assurance that a few blaster bolts wouldn't set off the charges. He was sprawled on top of them. Proximity made you skeptical. There were 50 battle droids in the column heading for Embrani. If he managed to knock out the ground station, that would be the first message he'd send on his long-range comlink. The chunk, chunk, chunk of their feet drew level with him, and he froze. Chunk, 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 chunk. It began to fade behind him. He breathed again. Once the excavator droid was coaxed past its logical destinations of the screening plant, it would be that much more conspicuous. At least the tinnies looked busy. The worst part was having a pretty good idea about what orders they'd been given. Just 10 clicks, he was minutes away from the point where the droid would attempt to deliver its load. At that moment, he'd divert it toward Teklet itself, through the center of the town and into the ground station's compound. At least the aerial reese appeared to have been right about that. Teklet was a sprawl of storage silos and shipping facilities for getting produce off the planet, and not much else. The worst that the Trade Federation had ever anticipated dealing with was a band of angry farmers. It was going to make his job a good deal easier. Just ahead, the droid's flashing lights bounced off a sign pointing left. All contractors traffic, no entry via main gate. The excavator knew it was its way and began slowing for the turn. Nina took Aten's jury-rigged cables and unplugged one strand. Go on, go. The droid was almost at the turn. It was moving at around 25 clicks now, threatening to veer off. But it carried on, past the sign, past the slip road, and on toward Teklet. That's my boy, Nina said. The street prickled between his shoulder blades. Despite his suit's environment controls, couldn't speed up a bit, could you? Maybe that was asking for trouble. When he eased his head clear of the layer of rubble and peered around the side of the scoop, he could see processions of droids strung out behind him along the curve of the road, neatly lying astern like battlecruisers, each flashing an orange hazard light with its outline picked out in blue. It was actually pretty, all things considered. Then the nearest droid slowed and peeled off down the slip road, the light show behind Nina fading, then disappearing altogether. He was on his own. He settled back under the rubbles, with his head tilted, so that he could see ahead, through a channel in the debris. Teklet had little in the way of street lighting, and there were few people about. as architecture went, this wasn't tasteful, elegant Tipoca. It was a service depot, and it looked like one. A couple of Tantosians were sitting under an awning outside a hut, blasters across their laps. They stared at the droid with vague curiosity, but didn't appear to move. Nina was almost past the ribbon of huts when the thought struck him that a 500-meter blast zone would take out a lot of Teklet and people with it. Not all of them were separatists. Once you make that your concern, they'll always have a weapon to use against you, Scarata said. They had to get used to it. Achieving your objectives sometimes had a high price. A bonded cargo transporter with red security straps sealing its containers crossed in front of him. The droid missed it by 2 seconds. If the driver was cutting it that close, then they hadn't taken much notice of the machine. So far so good, and getting better. As the droid pressed on, Nana was checking his escape route. It was a good 200-meter sprint to the nearest cover from any part of the road. It was going to be tight. He had to get that droid to halt right alongside the ground station. If it kept going, the blast would be centered elsewhere. He could set the jets now, slide out of the scope, and run for it. But that meant observing the droid up to the last second, and that meant he'd probably be too close when it blew. But he was committed now. The ground stations had to go. It would put a serious dent in the Separatist defenses for a few critical days, maybe even weeks, and that was an edge they needed. Looking some rubble aside with his finger, Nina could see the lights in the lights of the compound. He flicked to night vision, and the green image showed him flimsy mesh, fencing, and a waist-high retaining wall. The excavator would roll right over it on its path to the building itself. They'd know he was there, all right. He'd left the jets until last. The charges were linked by cord in series, just waiting for the final connections to the 3 detonators that, in theory, Nina could trigger remotely. He clamped the cords together and shoved them into the aperture of the jet housings, snapping them shut. The explosives were now live. He wasn't just sitting on a bomb. He was sitting in one. The charges, dispersed among the rubble, were up to his neck. He began to ease his legs clear, ready to jump. If he didn't walk away from this, then that was the way it had to be. For a moment, Nina felt a cold spasm in his gut that he recognized from a dozen all-too-real exercises. He was probably going to get killed. He was possibly going to get killed. If anyone thought intensive training wiped out the fear of dying, they were wrong. He was as afraid as he was when live rounds had flown past him for the first time. It never went away. He just learned to live with it, and tried to learn well enough that he could use it to work for him, and get him out of trouble faster. Nina fumbled with his cabling. He steered the droid in a gentle arc so that it was square on to the fence. It wasn't the best course he'd ever steered, but with a 500-meter blast zone, it was going to be good enough. He ducked. The wire mesh loomed in his face at the edge of the scoop, then strained a vibrant, tearing up post with it as the droid pushed through oblivious. It was nearly at the wall. The building was 5 meters high. Flat roof, no windows. They didn't seem to like windows here. He heard a single shout, something like "Chubba," and he had to agree. This was going to Fairfax someone's watch, with a lot of reports. Nina yanked the cables apart and cut the droid's power. Its momentum carried it on a few more meters, and metal twanged and squealed as the chain-link fence was stretched to the breaking point. The wires finally snapped back, like a bowstring under the excavator's wheels. 1, 2, 3. The droid was at a dead stop, hard against the wall. The blocks were beginning to crack, and gaps were opening between them. He had a sudden vision of finding himself buried in collapsing masonry and unable to move. And the combinations of animal panic and a lifetime of training propelled him out of the rubble and over the edge of the scoop. He fell flat from 2 meters and struggled to right himself. Then there was shouting and 50-kilo pack or not. He executed the fastest bug out of his career. These in one hand, and the remote net control in the other. There was one way out, and that was through the gap he'd smashed in the fence. It wasn't covert. A human in an overall was standing open-mouthed in his path, and Nina knocked him flat on his back as he ran full tilt for the hole in the mesh. He had about a minute to put distance between himself and the ground stations before he blew the charges. At 20 clicks an hour, that meant he'd be about Fairfax. Just do it. Nina was past the first line of trees and into long grass when he dropped and pressed the remote net in both hands. Teklet was a sudden ball of light. Then the roar of air and the shock wave shook him. He crouched as debris rained down on him, hoping, really hoping, that Catan armor was all that it was cracked up to be. Geshoken was the first to admit that it was taking a lot less to get him irritated lately. He waited long enough. He tapped the comlink console impatiently. I asked to be out through to Skosisk-Com 10 minutes ago, they cut. I realize that, Major. He'll be with you as soon as he is free. Enemy forces have infiltrated, and I need to speak to your commanding officer. Do you understand what we have on Quilora? Could you possibly shift your Dekutla Shebs long enough to find out why this is so vital to the war? Sir, we have Republic troops infiltrating more places than I care to name right now, so... The screen flickered and broke up in noise. Hokuran switched to another channel and got the same crackling, simmering display. It was the same for every channel he tried. His first thought was that someone had disabled his receiver. They were closer than he'd thought, and a lot more daring. He put on his helmet and edged cautiously down the passage to the exterior door, his Verpine shadow gun in one hand and a hunting vibroblade in the other. The droid sentry stepped aside to let him pass. On the roof, the comm relay was intact. Hokin took out his personal comlink and called Harati. All Hokin could hear was the chatter of static. It struck him that the Republic troops might well have done what he would have, faced with the same target. Droid, can you make contact with your fellows? Affirmative, sir. The droids had their own comlink system. They could communicate instantly on any battlefield. What they didn't need was the main relay at Teklet in order to do it. Can you contact Lieutenant Harati? The droid paused for a few moments. I have him, sir. Ask him if he has any news of Teklet. Pause. A much longer pause. Large explosions seen in the directions of Teklet, sir. Is what I'd do if I was preparing an assault, Hokin thought. I'd rendered my enemies blind and deaf. There was nothing he could do on the ground to do with an invasion. If one was coming, there was a Republic assault ship in Kulora space, and that didn't bode well. He had two options for his immediate task. He could defend Uthan's project, the technical knowledge invested in her and her staff, and the nanovirus itself. Or if he was overrun, he could prevent it falling into enemy hands to be studied and neutralized. It was a big planet. If he had to run, they'd have to find him. In the meantime, he'd sit tight and wait for them to come. Tell Harati I want every functioning droid back here now, Hokin said. We are digging in. 12. Coruscant Command to Republic Assault Ship Majestic, Kulora Sector. Cruiser Vengeance will all be with you at 0400. You have clearance to intercept any vessel leaving Kulora space, prevent landing by non-Republic vessels, and engage any vessel failing to comply. Have biohazard containment standing by. Nana struggled to his feet and stared back at the ground station. It wasn't there anymore. Neither were the few small huts scattered along the approach road. There was billowing smoke and fires burning, including one that looked as if it were a blowtorch. Another explosion made him shield his head, and more debris peppered his armor. Apart from that, the area was silent. He set off through the trees again, feeling as if he'd been picked up and shaken hard by someone really angry. A small pack of Gadans began chasing him, snapping on his leg armor, but they caught on fast that he was going to be impossible to eat and fell back. He opened his long-range comlink for the first time in days. Nina here. Anyone receiving? He could hear his own breath rasping as he ran. He was down to a stumbling jog now, and feeling the reality of his exhaustion. He'd take a stim or two later. He had to. Sarge, Fi here. Target acquired. Then. Wow, P for plenty. You sound busy. On my way to the RV. You're running? You bet, Sitrep. Had to dump the droid and cache a lot of stuff. But the Reekray can carry a surprising amount if you ask him nicely. ETA an hour or so. Call Darman in case Janot hasn't caught up with him yet. Copy that, ETA. Depends. Looking for transport right now. You sure about that? You can do fast or you can do covert. Right now, fast looks good to me. Out. Nina kept close enough to the road to hear vehicles. He needed a speeder. The mangled chassis of a personal transport of some kind was upended at the side of the road, testimony to the force of the blast. Eventually, someone would show up to take a look at the damage. Then he'd have his chance. After a few minutes, Nina was starting to see intact buildings through the trees. He was nearing the farthest edge of the blast zone. Farther ahead, he could see lights coming toward him, and his visor told him they were approaching fast. He dropped down into the cover of the grass. As they got nearer, he could pick out one land speeder and a speeder bike. Nina couldn't face walking back into the blast zone to take one. He'd have to stop them here, and he'd have to stop them with minimum damage, or else he'd still be hiking back to the RV point. He aimed his rifle on sniper settings and waited until the land speeder was within 300 meters. It didn't surprise him that it wasn't an emergency vehicle. He could see the driver clearly, a Trandoshan. They didn't have a record in humanitarian public service. He was probably rushing to see if his slave traffic had been affected by the blast. The speeder was killing a Trandoshans as well. Nina squeezed gently, and the bolt shattered the land speeder's screen. The vehicle veered right off the road, spraying mud and gravel in the air, and the speeder bike swung left and pulled up dead. For a moment, the rider hesitated, instinctively looking around in the dark as if unsure what had happened. But then he appeared to work it out just as Nina's second bolt caught him full in the chest. The speeder bike hung motionless, a meter above the ground. There was a lot to be said for night vision visors. Nina ran from cover and swung onto the speeder, catching his pack on the back of the seat. He savored the moment, taking the weight off his feet, ranked near the top of the list of primeval human needs. Along with a long drink of ice-cold water, the relief was wonderful. A good night's sleep and a decent hot meal would have rounded it off perfectly. The sooner he got back to his squad and finished the job in hand, the sooner he'd be able to indulge. He steered the speeder into the woods and headed south with newly uplifted spirits. Pinpricks of light formed a small constellation ahead of Etain. They might have been a kilometer away, While they might have been within arm's reach, she couldn't tell by sight alone, but she could certainly smell their breath. It was a cloying, sickly scent of raw meat. She swiped her lightsaber across the entrance to the shelter, and the Gedan scattered. She had tried using the Force to persuade them to bother someone else, but it only succeeded in making them more curious, although they had stopped trying to take bites out of her. "How do you do it, Janot? How do you keep them at bay?" She sat huddled under the covering Darman had constructed, and listened to the water working its way down through the leaves. The rain had stopped, but the runoff was still trickling through and plopping on the sheet of plastoid above her head. She could hear again, at least in one ear. She could also see very clearly. What she saw was the face of the brawny she'd almost decapitated with a lightsaber. Panic and fear had pushed the events from her mind, but now that she was quiet and tired, it flooded back and wouldn't go away. Etain tried to meditate for the first time in days, shutting out the irritating drip of water on her head. Darman prowled around outside, silent and unnerving. She could feel him ebbing and flowing, anxious, even a little scared, but focused and devoid of violence or inner conflict. She wanted to ask him how he'd achieved that balance. They had both been raised in complete isolations from the everyday world, with their own set of values and disciplines, not because they had been chosen to be different, but because they had been born that way. Their calling was random, genetic, unfair. He'd obviously succeeded brilliantly. She had failed in equal measure. She let the sensations of his clarity wash over her. It was almost soothing. Then it was suddenly gone, and a wave of pure exhilaration hit her like a body blow. Darman thrust his head through the entrance to the shelter. "They're coming," he said. "My squad's on its way." He paused, as if he was listening to something, his glove held against the side of his helmet. It was odd to watch someone so obviously delighted, without having the slightest idea of his facial expression. An hour or so. Nina's taking out the comm stations at Teklet. Fai and Atin had acquired a bit more gear that'll come in handy, plus a prisoner. He paused again. His head was moving as if he was talking. He appeared to be able to switch back and forth between being audible and inaudible to her, as if his helmet was a separate environment into which he could retreat at will. A weak way, of all things. Oh well, they've got their reasons. He was utterly still for a few moments before nodding vigorously. He eased off his helmet, and his face was one broad grin, aimed at nothing in particular. "They're all right, I take it," Etain said. "They're fine." "I'm glad. Your brother's right." "No, not really." "All right, you're clones." "They're not my original squad," Darman said. His expressions was still all delight and good humor. "My brothers were all killed at the Battle of Geonosis, and so were theirs. We didn't even know each other before this mission, but three of us had the same training sergeant, so I suppose we'll feel like family, except Atin, of course. It was an extraordinary statement. Daman showed not the slightest sign of being wounded by his recent loss. Etain knew little of biological families, but she knew that losing Masophilia would still hurt badly in 3 months' time, and even in 3 years. Perhaps they'd bred grief out of clones too. You don't miss your brothers then? Daman's grin slowly relaxed. Of course I do, he said, quietly, every day. You seem to be taking it calmly. We know we're likely to get killed. If we dwell on that, we won't be any use to anyone. You just get on with it. That's what our old training sergeant used to say. We're all going to die sometime, so you might as well die pushing the odds for something that matters. Etain wanted to ask him what mattered to him about the Republic's cause. She was almost afraid to, but she needed to know. What do you think you're fighting for, Daman? He looked blank for a moment. Peace, ma'am. Okay. What do you think you're fighting against? Anarchy and injustice. It was a rote response, but he paused as if considering it for the first time. Even if people aren't grateful. That sounds like your training sergeant too. He wasn't wrong though, was he? Etain thought of the locals who had betrayed them to Hogan's men. Yes, she'd learned a lot about the reality of conflict in the last few weeks, but it still wasn't enough. It's getting light, Daman said. He sat down cross-legged in the hide, armor plates clacking against something. You look cold. Need any more painkillers? Etain had achieved a constant level of dampness and pain that she could live with. She was too tired to think of doing anything else. She'd even stopped noticing the persistent odor of red merle wool. I'm okay. If we light a fire, we'll be a magnet for half the separatist army. He rummaged in his belt and held out a ration cube to her. Still that incongruous amalgam of fresh naivete and utterly clinical killer. She shook her head. He pulled out a bag, dried kuvara. She realized from the way he had put the fruit carefully in his belt, and not in his pack, that he prized it. He lived on rations with all the taste appeal of rancid malt hide. The sacrifice was rather touching. She'd have plenty of time to gorge herself on the galaxy's varied foods, provided she got off Quilora alive. But Daman wouldn't. She managed a smile and waved it away. No, eat up. That's an order. He didn't need encouraging. He chewed with his eyes closed, and she felt desperately sorry for him, yet a little envious of his delight in ordinary things. I know a good way to warm up, he said, and opened his eyes. Etain bristled. Maybe he wasn't as naive as he seemed. You do? If you're filling up, to it. Up to what? Daman made a wait-and-see gesture with one raised finger and got up to go outside. No, Eugene thought. He wouldn't have meant that at all. She was suddenly embarrassed that she'd even imagined he might. She stared at the backs of her hands, suddenly appalled at their abrasions and broken nails and general ugliness. A roughly trimmed pole was thrust into the shelter. She jumped. She didn't need any more surprises. If that's supposed to be funny, Daman, I'm not laughing. Come on, Commander. He peered down the length of the pole. Lightsaber drill. Let's do it now, before you have to for real. I just want to rest. I know. He squatted down and stared at her. I don't know much about swords either, but I'm trained in hand-to-hand combat. He didn't move. His persistence annoyed her. Actually, it suddenly angered her. She'd had enough. She was exhausted, and she wanted to sit numbly and do absolutely nothing. She jumped to her feet, snatched the pole, and ran at him. He sidestepped her, but only just. Relatively safe way to perfect your lightsaber skills, Dunman said. Relatively? She held the pole two-handed, furious. Relatively, Dunman said, and brought his own mock lightsaber around sharply on her shin. Ow, you! Come on, do your rest, Daman. Let's back out of the range of a savage and uncontrolled lunge. That's it. Come at me. That was the point at which she always stumbled. The fine line between giving maximum effort and being blinded by angry violence. You have to mean it. It's not a game anymore. She came at him with a two-handed sweep from right to left, cracking hard against his weapon, and feeling the impact in her wrists and elbows, forcing Daman onto his back foot. 3 more rapid sweeps, right, left, and then one immediately downwards, unexpected, hitting him so hard between neck and shoulder that if the pole had been a real lightsaber, she would have sliced him in half. She heard the sickening thwack. It was the first time she'd seen him in pain. It was a split second of grimace, no more. But she was instantly appalled at herself. Sorry, she said, but he came straight back at her and sent the stake flying from her hand. You have to press home your advantage, Daman said, rubbing his neck. I've never used an energy blade, and I don't have the force to call on, but I do know when to go all out. I know, Etain said, inspecting her shin and catching her breath. Did I do any damage? Nothing serious. Good move. I don't want to let you down when you need me most. You've done fine so far, Commander. How can you do all this, Starman? Do what? Fight? Kill and remain detached. Training, I suppose. And whatever it was in Jango's fete that made him detached. Were you ever afraid in training? Almost always. Did you ever get hurt? All the time. Others died. It's how you learn. Getting hurt teaches you to shoot instinctively. That's why our instructors began training us with simunition that would hurt us without causing permanent damage. Then we moved on to live rounds. How old were you then? 4, perhaps 5. She hadn't known that. It made her shudder. She couldn't recall any Jedi dying in training. It was another world. She picked up her pole and made a few slow passes with it, her gaze fixed on its tip. I find this accelerated growth difficult to comprehend. It's a Kaminoan industrial secret. I mean that it's hard for me to reconcile what you appear to be and what you can do with someone who's had less experience of the profane world than even a Padawan. Sergeant Scarada told us we perplexed him. You talked about him a lot. He trained my squad and also 9ers and 5s. That might be why they put us together for this mission when our brothers were killed. Etain felt ashamed. There was no self-pity in him whatsoever. What will they do with you in 30 years, when you're too old to fight? I'll be dead long before then. That's rather fatalistic. I mean that we'll always age faster than you. We've been told decline for clones is mercifully swift. Slow soldiers get killed. I can't think of a better time to die than when I'm no longer the best. Etain really didn't want to hear anything more about death right then. Death was happening all too easily and frequently, as if it didn't matter and had no consequences. She could feel the force being distorted around her, not the regular rhythm of life as it was meant to be, but the chaos of destruction. She felt she could neither accept it nor influence it. We're supposed to be peacekeepers, she said wearily. This is ugly, but war always is. Calling it peacekeeping doesn't change anything. It's different, Etain said. Daman pursed his lips, looking slightly past her as if rehearsing something difficult in his mind. Sergeant Scarata said that civvies didn't have a clue, and that it was all right for them to have lofty ideas about peace and freedom, as long as they weren't the ones being shot at. He said nothing focuses your mind better than someone trying to kill you. That stung. Etain wondered if the comment were just an unguarded recollections, or a subtle rebuke of her principles. Daman appeared equally capable of either. She still hadn't come to terms with his duality. Killer and innocent, soldier and child, educated intelligence and grim humor. Undistracted by a normal life, he seemed to have spent more time in contemplation than ever she had. She wondered how much the intense experience of the outside world would change him. She'd killed just one fellow living being. It had certainly changed her. Come on, he said. Sun's coming up. Might dry out your clothes. It was definitely autumn. A mist had blanketed the countryside like a sea. A puddle had formed in the sheeting stretch over the top of the shelter, and Darman went to scoop it out but stopped. "What are those things?" he asked. "I saw them on the river too." Ruby and sapphire-colored insects were dancing above the surface of the puddle. "Daywings," Etain said. "I've never seen colors like it. They hatch and take flight for a day, and they die by the evening," she said. "A brief and glorious." Her voice trailed off. She was appalled at her own insensitivity. She began assembling an apology, but Darman didn't appear to need one. "They're amazing," he said, completely absorbed by the spectacle. "They certainly are," she said, and watched him. Lick and Kit's villa had been splendid. It was still splendid in its unnecessary way, but the polished Kuvara floors with their intricately inlaid flower motif borders were now scuffed and gouged by the metal feet of droids. Ankit hovered in the doorway, while these 4 droids screwed alloy sheets across the window frames, shutting out the sunrise. Gezokan watched the progress of the conversations, from mansions to fortress. "You'll split the wood," Ankit hissed. "Careful. Do you know how long it took to have those panels carved?" Hogan shrugged. "I'm not a carpenter." "They were not made by carpenters. They were made by artists. I don't care if Supreme Chancellor Palpatine carved them himself with a dinner fork. I need to secure this building. You have a perfectly adequate purpose-built facility, not 3 kilometers from here. You could defend that, and I have." "Why? Why ruin my home when Uthin is no longer here?" "For a devious and treacherous little bean counter, Ankit. You show a surprising lack of tactical creativity." Hogan walked over to the Nemorian and stood close to him. He would not be intimidated by this grocer's height. He didn't care if he had to crane his neck to look him in the eye. He was the bigger man. "I know she's no longer here. The enemy might believe she is. If I observed my enemy making lavish preparations to defend an installation, I might assume it was a bluff and investigate an alternative target. If I found that alternative target discreetly, prepared against intruders, I would make an educated guess that it was the real objective and attack it." And Kit appeared unconvinced. He glared at Hokan with half-lidded red eyes, which was a rare show of courage for him. And how would they spot the discreet reinforcements? "I've made sure that supplies have been seen arriving here, with an accompanying degree of security procedures. Movement by night, that sort of thing. Given the nobility of the local populations, I'm sure someone will trade that information for some bauble or other. It always worked for me. This reinforcement will not save my home from destructions. You're right, Ankit. Wooden structures don't bear up well to cannons. That's why I moved Dr. Uthens back to the facility. If I have to, I can actually defend metal and stone more successfully." "So why did you move her here in the first place?" I'm surprised that you even have to ask. To keep everyone guessing, of course. It had seemed like a sensible idea at the time. He hadn't known what he was dealing with. Now he was fairly sure that he was facing no more than 10 men. Had an army landed, he'd have known by now. Moving Uthin not a task he could achieve in complete secrecy anyway. Had helped thicken the fog of confusion. Hoken was leaving nothing to chance. He was laying a trail of clues that would lead the enemy commandos to one conclusion: that Uthin and the nanovirus were barricaded in Lick and Kit's villa. A droid dragged a heavy alloy, joists through the salon, plowing a furrow in the golden floorboards, and Kit let out a muffled squeal of frustration. The droid's comrades lifted the joist and aligned it with a horizontal beam, knocking over a fine Naboo vase and smashing it. Droids weren't programmed to say oops and sweep up the fragments. They simply crunched through them, oblivious. And Kit was shaking again. He screamed for a servant. A sullen-looking local boy appeared with a brush and swept the debris into a pan. "Oh dear," Hoken said. He didn't think it was the right time to mention that the labyrinth of Rhine cellars and secure vaults beneath the villa was now packed with explosives. He didn't know how to revive a Nemorian who had fainted, and he had no intentions of learning. Lieutenant Harati was writing outside the front door. Even when not under scrutiny, Harati stood with military composure. Hoken had never caught him sneaking a drink from a flask or squashing himself. Harati didn't straighten up when he saw Hoken, because he was already at attention. "Sir, Dr. Uthin is getting irritated about the disruptions," the lieutenant said. "I'll talk to her. How is our droid signal chain working out?" "It's adequate, sir. But I would feel more secure if we had comm monitoring online." "My boy, there was a time when we had no listening stations, and we had to fight wars by observations in our own writs. It can be done." "What have the droids spotted?" "The incursions appear to be limited to Teklet and the area to the south, sir, and quite specific in nature. At least we know why they attacked the quarry office. I have to say, I haven't encountered an excavator bomb before." Harati licked his lips nervously. "Sir, are you sure you don't want any patrols to search the Teklet road?" "I'd be happy to do it, myself, sir. It's no trouble." Hoken took it for the genuine concern. It was rather than a criticism. "No, we could be chasing Gadan trails all over the region. Our enemy is obviously good at diversionary tactics, and I'm not going to take any bait. I'll wait for them to take mine." He patted Harati's back. "If you're anxious to be busy, keep an eye on our Kit. I don't want him interfering. Restrain him by any means you consider necessary." Harati saluted. "Will do, sir. Also, Lieutenant Kuvin, I don't think he will make captain as you said." Hoken liked Harati more every day. Has his removal from the promotion list been noted by your fellow officers? It has, sir. Good, well done. Hirati was proven to be a loyal aide. He was eager to obey. Hoken decided he would have to watch him. He promoted him anyway. There was nothing to be gained by willfully ignoring excellence in another.